Hello, welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Mindy Wright, a member of CMC's Board of Trustees and the director of the nonprofit Higher Education Alliance. Welcome, everybody. Happy to see you here today. Today's forum, Affordable Housing is Complicated, is sponsored by National Church Residences, Ohio Capital Corporation for Housing, Community Shelter Board, and Columbus Business First. Each of our sponsors and partners are represented here by many friends and associates. Won't you please help me thank them? And now, please help me welcome Peg Mortal, President of Ohio Capital Corporation for Housing, to introduce our forum.
Thanks, Mindy. Ohio Capital Corporation for Housing is proud to support the Columbus Metropolitan Club and its mission to engage community conversations on important topics. Affordable housing challenges are affecting the growth and vitality of the metro area, and if affordability is a key selling point for Columbus, how can we make this a reality for current and future residents? Our panelists offer some creative solutions, works in progress, and potential policy adjustments to address the issues. Let's explore them. Save your questions, and please welcome our speakers. CEO of Moody Nolan, Curt Moody. Director of the Department of Development, City of Columbus, Schoeny. Vice President, Real Estate and Development at Homeport, Leah Evans. And our host, whom I listen to on a very regular basis for the last several years, a journalist at the Ohio Statehouse News Bureau, Andy Chow. Andy, it's all yours.
All right, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. As you know, we're talking about housing affordability in Columbus, and I was actually born and raised here in Central Ohio in the Columbus area. And if you've been around for the past couple of decades, you've probably noticed Columbus is changing. The population is growing. In fact, in Forbes magazine last year, it said that Columbus is the only large northern city to see a population growth of more than 10% from 2010 to 2017. Neighborhoods are seeing economic development. You probably have noticed the short north has completely transformed, and we're seeing the same transformation in the Brewery District, in Franklinton, Old Town East. You're seeing these large residential areas pop up. I was telling the panel here I needed to get away from work for a little bit this morning to kind of put the finishing touches on today's forum, so I went to the Roosevelt Coffee Shop along Long Street, and if you're familiar with that area, all sorts of new developments are popping up. Across the street from me was this large residential building, and then more buildings are being built down the road. So we're seeing a lot of changes. We're seeing a lot of population growth. We're seeing a lot more people come here, more jobs coming here, and then large residential areas popping up. But what does this all mean for Columbus's future and for our conversation today, the city's housing affordability? Yes, there are more jobs and more people coming, but a report from the Building Industry Association of Central Ohio says the population growth is outpacing the amount of residential builds, and the housing prices are exceeding the growth of household incomes. I was just telling the table here that I bought a house last year and learned firsthand what the housing market is like and what it means to try to look for a house in Bexley compared to Reynoldsburg, compared to Canal Winchester, which is where I eventually ended up in. So let's get started by sending this topic to the panel of experts. I want to go down the table here. First, Curt, I want to start with you, and then we'll just keep moving down. But I want you to introduce yourself and then talk briefly about how your office or company plays a role in the whole issue of affordable housing.
Okay. Again, Curt Moody, CEO of Moody Nolan. We're an architectural firm that has our headquarters here, but we practice nationwide and have 12 other offices throughout the United States. Affordable housing is very, very important to us in each of the communities we work. And and some of this may be discussed today, what we found out, not just amongst our firm, but as an architect, we can design wonderful, beautiful houses. We can design houses that are economically constructed, but that's not the answer. It's people still can't afford the end product, no matter how thorough we've been with our design. So the solution has to be a combination of design and programs that offer new homeowners or potential homeowners ways to accomplish the end goal of buying a house. And we have some ideas that hopefully we'll discuss here today.
Thank you, Andy. So I'm Leah. I work for Homeport. We are a 32-year-old nonprofit based here in Central Ohio. We own over 2,600 units and house over 6,200 people. And our role is to be a development partner with the community. We are great partners with our city and with our county and with our other municipalities because we want to be a solution to the housing needs that the community brings forward. So when we talk about affordability in my context, generally, yes, it relates to tax credits or subsidy or some sort of assistance that we get to develop housing, but affordability is a much broader topic than that. Affordability is relative, and we've tried to use different words. So we call it attainable housing. We call it workforce. We change what we call it so it doesn't have the stigma that's attached to it, but affordability is a widespread problem across our community, as Andy was alluding to. As we grow and market pressures come on the existing housing stock, then the need for not just our families that are making minimum wage, our families that are making $12, $15 an hour, $20 an hour can't go out to the marketplace and afford what's being built or what's being built for sale. So we really look to be a widespread work with the community to address that on multiple levels. And it takes all of our partners. I look across this room and I see our partners from Huntington and the Trust and the Land Bank and the city, and it takes all of these voices at the table to come up with multiple solutions for the continuum of housing needs that our community has. So it's been our pleasure to be with communities, with residents, with neighbors, and with our partners in working on the solutions.
Good afternoon. Excuse me. Good afternoon. I'm Steve Schoeny. I am the Development Director for the City of Columbus. So the Development Department works in housing in a couple different ways. We are the home to the city's housing division, so we work with developers like Homeport that are developing low-income housing to help them cover their financing gaps. We also have programs for low-income homeowners to help them keep their homes basically warm, safe, and dry. We have a lot of homeowners who have their homes who struggle with those issues. We do some work ourselves and contract with Homeport to help on that. We also are home to the city's land bank. We own, looking at John Turner's 1,600-ish formerly vacant and abandoned properties, that if you have any interest in acquiring one, please see John Turner after, or visit our website. So we have a lot of play in that. We also are responsible for the city's planning division as well as the economic development division. So really we play in all aspects of housing. And that combination really is important because you cannot address housing issues unless you address their context in the entirety of the city and the region's economy. So to the title of this luncheon, it is complex.
Like you said, Steve, it is complex. And so I want to go to Leah. You kind of touched on this a little earlier. What exactly are we talking about when we talk about affordable or attainable housing? What does it look like? Are they apartment complexes? Are they townhomes? Are they single structures? What are we talking about?
It's all of that. Mm-hmm. So we are members of ULI, and if you've heard their study, they talk about the missing middle. So one of the things that is happening in our development industry is that we've skewed to the market demand for single-family attached garage houses, and we don't see as much of a development spectrum as it relates to people used to live in duplexes. There's a lot of them around the city. Ask John, he has some for sale maybe. You should talk to him. So like people used to live in fourplexes, and they used to live in different styles of housing, but we moved away from that, and I think that's one of the things Mr. Moody will talk about is the style of house and the opportunity for diversity diversity of housing types also speaks to affordability. So what I would pay for a single-family detached house with a garage is not what I'm going to pay for a row house or what I'm going to pay for a duplex. And so that speaks to affordability as well. We usually talk about it in terms of income and targeting what someone can afford based on their income, which is really important work and valuable to this conversation, but that conversation is much broader as it relates to what we're building, how we're building it, and then how does that impact the affordability in the community. And it gets back to our partnerships with the communities and our regulatory environment that we're in. When Andy spoke back about the BIA study, they were here a few months ago talking about, what are the pressures on the development community and why aren't we keeping up with this demand as we've brought in new population and new jobs and there's a demand for housing. And so we have to walk in step with our partners on the public sector to be able to address that need and be able to address that affordability across the spectrum.
And Andy, to answer the question a little differently, I think when you think about it, you can divide the housing affordability spectrum into a few different buckets. When folks talk about market rate housing, they're talking about basically housing that doesn't have any subsidy, is built for folks making, households making, let's call it, I don't know, $65,000+ a year. Then you have a middle income tier. The median household income in Columbus is, let's call it in the Columbus region is, let's call it $62,000 a year. I'm looking at William Murdoch to make sure I got my numbers right. He's nodding. So $62,000 a year is median household income. So if you look at households between, let's say $45,000 a year and $60,000 a year, let's call that kind of middle income. Folks will refer to that as workforce housing. You've got that chunk of the market that all operates kind of the same. And then you've got another chunk of the market that's, let's call it $40,000 to $25,000 a year that operates in a certain fashion. And then you've got below $25,000 a year. And in that category below $25,000 a year, you're dealing with populations that have serious barriers to work. Serious challenges for a variety of reasons. That's a whole nother luncheon to talk about those reasons.
Yes.
But that's kind of how, as we roughly, without using the dreaded term of percentage of area median income, that's how we kind of think about it in buckets.
Curt, when you develop affordable housing, who are the clients you're working with?
They're very broad, and as you heard from Leah, I mean, they're the age groups and also the income levels are what Steve had indicated. But I do want to address kind of a forgotten group, and that has to do. There are individuals that are in a state that will never have a house they can afford in their lifetime. There are individuals, and we were concentrating on the Linden area, for instance, and the income average is less than $30,000 a year. So how do they get a mortgage and buy a house? So let's say we do a house that's very inexpensive, and we build a house, and just going to say, because Homeport has a house on the market for $120,000, and you say, so, but it costs about $180, $190 to build. So you have 120 that in the market, but then you're still saying a person with $30,000 a year income is supposed to be able to get a mortgage, and there's no bank that's going to loan that person those funds. So there has to be offsetting costs. There has to be ways to fund it, and there are those that say, well, maybe they don't deserve funding. Well, I happen to take a different approach. So we developed a plan, we call it the Legacy Project, and the Legacy House, that we said there are individuals that never will get a house, but we can give them one. And so, matter of fact, we had a lot of contributors in this room, Ohio Housing Corporation, Capital Corporation, CMHA, others kind of helped, and to provide a family who otherwise could not afford to get a home. And we said, let's take one step at a time. But as Leah knows, we're talking to Homeport because they do a wonderful job in the community, and what they do and their programs that they teach families how to manage a home, how to take care of a home. All of that has to be part of it. So we can't look at affordability as giving a low-cost number and that's the end of it. It's got to be all those other things that come in. And then we got to take into account that there are those at the lower end of the average that we can provide some housing for them too, but we've got to be more creative than just designing a low-cost house. It's got to be a program.
So how do you do that? What steps do you take? How do we remedy the situation?
One step at a time, and everyone in this room, quite frankly, can have an impact. We were talking the other day, and we've kind of developed a new approach of let's not make any more excuses. We can all make excuses why we don't do something. So the idea is do what you can, when you can, with what you got, while you've got it. So let's just take that. Let's take what each of us brings and find out how we can leverage that to help someone else. We purposely didn't want to know who the family was going to receive the home so that we weren't thinking we're going to benefit from what they could do for us. We just said, let's and a group like this help do that.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
We can do more of that. And that end is going to bring up the other end because we got to get the income, we've got to get the value because net worth is important. So somebody who has zero now has net worth. That builds assets and that helps.
Can you give me any specific examples of how maybe companies or somebody from the private sector can help in any way?
Absolutely. Right now, Steve knows that as they're looking at the Linden plan, that it can't be done by one agency. The city itself, it can't be the only partner. It has to be private sector. So we've got to leverage private sector, providing some dollars, and public sector. I'll give you just a quick analysis. Let's say we were doing the most affordable house we possibly can, and it's a 3-bedroom house, and all cost involved is $150,000. Well, the only way for someone at a lower income to afford it is to make it attractive for someone, first of all, to want it. So let's say we have a what's called an affordability fund that offsets, I'm going to say 50% of that cost. Well, you go into the Linden area, and some of the highest appraised homes are $60,000. So, personally, I'm not buying a $120,000 house next to a 60. But if they've been provided a house that is costing them 75, that's a risk worth taking. Now, they can at 75 better able to finance that with the help of groups like Homeport than they are if it is 150. So if the private sector is putting a fund together with the city's fund, and there's a matching 50-50 fund, affordability fund, then you can write down the cost of the house, and you don't expect developers out of the goodness of their heart just to build for free. That's why I'm saying the model has to be incentive driven where others are going to come in and do this because they can make it work financially. And that's part of, I think, what we have to be looking at.
And so, Steve, go ahead, Leah.
I was going to make a point that I think Mr. Moody is also speaking to why is that important. So why would the private sector want to participate and be involved in this? Affordable housing relates to jobs and transportation. So for every one job we're creating, which we get very excited about job creation and bringing new investment to our community, and for every job we create, there's a commute and there's a person in a household. So how do we connect the growth that we're experiencing with the housing needs? As Steve was saying, how his department kind of, all those things kind of funnel up through his department. As we look at it as a community, it's about community development. And it's not just housing conversation. It really is about how do we link where people live with where they work? How do we link where people live with how they get to work? And so that there's a value to our private sector partners in participating in this work with us. And it's not just, we need to house as many people as possible. We can't get to the numbers. There's not a big enough fund. We're excited about the $50 million that the city is proposing for May. Go out and vote. But But we know that that's not even a drop up to what it's really going to take for our region to experience the kind of growth in affordable housing that will propel us forward in the future. So I think we need to stay consistent with connecting the growth in our region to the housing needs that our community is experiencing at every level of the spectrum. As Steve, was alluding to, we have at different incomes a different set of needs. So that housing may be in our permanent supportive housing space. It may be in our subsidized rent space. It may be in just a market alternative space for those that are at the higher end of the spectrum. But we have to connect that back to why that matters to a person who maybe has never experienced this. If you've never experienced having to be on a 2-year wait list, which is what we have at most of our properties, just to be able to get a rent that's still $700 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment, then that reality and that need isn't connected to you. And so I think we can do a better job of making sure that conversation takes a much broader view of the needs.
Steve, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to warn you, you're about to lose complete control of the panel. Yeah. So a couple of thoughts. One is I'm going to throw a little, this is a little dose of reality. With the model that Curt outlined for you, there's a $50,000 gap in that house that has to be made up by somebody. 50,000, and there's a gap of 54,000 housing units, according to the Affordable Housing Alliance in the city. For every 10,000 housing units, if you have a gap of $50,000 per housing units, for every 10,000, that's $500 million.
Where's that going?
Yeah.
Who's writing that check?
So that is not a problem the city of Columbus can take on, right? I mean, let's just be blunt, and let's recognize the scale of the issue. It is a problem that is going to take cooperation at all levels of government, and it's going to take cooperation from the private sector. I think what we're lucky with in this community is we do have private sector leaders like Curt, like we have one of the things that as I go around the country and I talk to folks and I talk about the great things in our community, one of the things that we're really blessed by is we're blessed by a local development community that's involved and cares and gets the issues. When you have the CEO of MI Homes taking on this issue and talking about it as publicly as Bobby did, and great work from our friends at Business First and kind of highlighting the issue in their piece. That's great. We've got banks that are really engaged, and I'm really hopeful about some things we've been working on with some folks about, how do we bring some more private sector dollars. We've got a lot of tools, but the challenge is huge. And I think one thing that we get a lot of times really focused on the housing part of the solution. But less than a year ago, we gave, I'm looking out the window to make sure I'm saying this right. Yeah, we gave every hospitality worker working in a place that you can see out the window about $1,000 a year raise, effectively, when we put in place the CPAS program, where every employee working in a building within the Capitol Crossroads, I'm looking at Cleve to make sure I get this right, because Cleve Ricksecker with the downtown special improvement districts and Morpsey and Coda worked really hard on this. If you work in one of those buildings now and your employer is participating, you get a free bus pass. That translates to $1,000 a year of expense. And it's an incredibly efficient way to deliver that kind of a subsidy. Yeah, I didn't do any, that's applause for them. I didn't do any of the work, I just talked about it. I think that's the kind of solutions that when we think about affordability, it's thinking about affordability in its totality.
So, Steve, with that in mind, let's take a broader look at the whole issue. Why should companies care if there is affordable housing out there? Why should it matter to the private sector to take on this issue?
Oh, that's easy. It's so the other, yeah, it is. So the other side of the other hat the other side of the world, the other side of my brain, however you want to phrase it, is the economic development side. And advantage for Columbus traditionally has been that we are a low-cost, high-value community. As our housing and transportation costs rise, that is eroding. And it is eroding significantly. And we are hearing that from our employers. We're hearing that from people who are looking at our community from the outside to come in new, those who are trying to expand. It is an issue that I think the corporate community and the business community is finding. People want I think I've said this here before, but excuse me if you've heard me say it before, previously. In the past, economic development was all about how far are you from a 4-lane limited access highway? Do you have a rail line? What's the size? How many kV can you deliver? How much gas can you deliver to the site? Today, it's how many people and what is their skill set. And we're blessed to have the equivalent, the equivalent of the world's largest 20th century coal mine, iron ore mine, an electric power plant with the Ohio State University in terms of generating that massive raw input into the economy. But if people can't afford to live here, if that cost of living gets passed on ultimately to the employers, because they're the ones who have to pay the employees. And so it really does matter. And it matters not just with the housing, but it also matters with the transportation.
So because I'm
go ahead real quick.
I told you lost.
We're going to stay here because though that is what we want to happen, that's not always necessarily what we see happening. So though that is a very clear reason that our private sector community should be really engaged in wanting to address this topic, until it actually affects them, until you have a plant where they cannot get employees there, then the reality of that is that are they really going to carve off 2 acres on that site for us to do a housing project? So I think we need to push that conversation so that we can have more creative solutions. Like the bus pass is a great creative solution to getting workers where you need to. Let's take that to the next step whereby we are participating. Our coastal partners and peers like us have been doing, for lack of a better word, called the company towns, where they are working in tandem with their business generating and job generating centers to put housing where they are. And that's, kind of like you go to the next level and take that next step so that you have a more tangible reality of what you're saying becomes in practice. Okay, I'll wrap it up. And I think, we talk about the Columbus way, but let's address that to all of our issues and not just the things that people get excited about. Steve and I know each other from back in the day when it was Ohio Department of Development, no longer, now ODSA, and people get excited about jobs. They want to hear about the new plant opening, and they want to hear about the newest innovation and new technology coming in their community. People don't get excited about the projects we bring. We just went through a very challenging community engagement process on a couple of projects that we presented to OFA this year. And so people don't get excited about the new 75-unit apartment building coming in next door to them. So how do we create that same desire and link what you're saying back to the actual work that's happening for the development activity?
And Leah, you bring up a great point. What are we talking about when it comes to location? How important is location? Curt, the house you were talking about was in Linden. How important is it to have the right location, especially when it comes to how close you are to the jobs that are available?
It's essential, but there are challenges with that for this reason. Any of us that decide we want to move, buy a place, we're going to take in certain factors. Is it secure, safe for our kids, families, all of those things? So where those areas in the city don't have those factors, then it's less desirable. So what happens? You don't see the activity. You see activity concentrated where it is more desirable. You see the same standard of living. You don't see your standard of living going down. You're not worried about your neighbor not taking care of their property. All of those things become drivers in where people decide to live and where we are normally hired to then design a complex or facilities for those individuals. So those areas become hot growth areas. The problem is that means we're leaving gaps in neighborhoods where we're not taking care of those issues so that they can become a desirable neighborhood as well. So we need to address that. And it can't be strictly just a lot of planning. one thing we do more in this city than most is we do a lot of plans and get people excited, and then we're on to the next set of plans. I mean,
we like to make plans. Like, that's the thing.
The issue is implement. You have to do something. So we need to, every time we do a plan, there ought to be an outcome of, we're going to plan, and at the end of this, we're going to do X, and something gets done versus it strictly being a plan. So that's part of what we need to do.
So how do we do this?
So hold on. So Curt, is this the right time to ask you for money to help us help with the housing plan that we're getting ready to do? So I'll be following up with you later. Thank you very much.
You can invoice him.
I have a follow-up question, but I want to let everyone know that we're coming up close to the Q&A time. So if you have a question, please step up to the microphone over here. Don't be shy. But first, let me throw out this last question. First with Steve, but then to everyone. So what we're talking about here is there are good things happening in Columbus. We're able to attract jobs here. Companies are coming here. There's economic development in these different neighborhoods. So how do you encourage economic development without the resulting displacement, without creating a housing market prices to go up? First Steve.
So if you have to leave and get to your 3 o'clock appointment, you can go ahead and leave now. I won't be done by the time we finish. I was too worried about the joke than the answer. So no, because the answer is too darn hard. It's complicated. I think that's the title. So there's a couple thoughts. One is neighborhoods that offer transportation choice are those neighborhoods that are going to see the most development pressure. That's fundamentally something that we've seen. People don't want to be told that they have to drive their car. They don't want to be told that they have to take the bus. They don't want to be told that they have to do anything. They want to be able to decide that if it's a decent day out, I'm going to ride my bike or grab a scooter or grab the bus. Or if they've got to deal with something in life, they want to have the choice of having a car. That's what we're seeing. So those are the neighborhoods where if you look at it and you think about where are the neighborhoods that we're seeing this quote-unquote gentrification pressure, those are the neighborhoods where you're seeing it. I think what we've learned from the short north is you have to start with affordability even if it doesn't feel like you have to yet. So when you look at what we're doing in Franklinton, everything that we're doing now in Franklinton incorporates some level of affordability into it, and that was the neighborhood where we started testing out our workforce housing policies. That's where we kind of tested the theories that we've applied to our incentive programs now. And so you've got to start with that. And even in neighborhoods like Linden, where we have a lot of I love this euphemism, naturally occurring affordable housing. I have a lot of naturally occurring greenery in my lawn that may not be grass. Even in those neighborhoods where you have a lot of this naturally occurring affordable housing, you have to start with affordability, because if you don't start with it, then it gets so much more expensive to add later on. And that's part of the strategy. We're looking at creative things like the land trust, but the biggest thing we're doing is we've got a lot of potential new money coming into the system. We're looking at raising a lot of money, and we're going to be partnering with MORPC to put together a strategy about what is the best way to spend the portfolio of money that we have currently, what's the additional kinds of money that we need to raise, and how do we deploy that money. So we're going to be, William and I are meeting right after this to talk about how we get that scope of work out, and I'll be following up with Curt to see what his check is to help support that. And so we're doing that. We're working with the county land bank on the land trust, and we're constantly looking for new ideas about how do we do this right. But it's, as I said earlier, the problem can overwhelm you if you let it. And we can't let it because it's too important.
And so we just have a couple minutes before we go to Q&A, so I'd love for both of you to jump in on this.
Okay, I'll make it quick, as quick as possible. He said gentrification first, so I'm just going to take that and we can start this conversation that we didn't go there much with our commentary, but, and Andy and I talked, revitalization and gentrification are not synonymous. You may have one without the other, and that's when I think is the opportunity for us that, as Mr. Moody was alluding to, there are areas that we want to see investment driven into. We want to see new development activity. We want to see the market teams come in and grow those communities. But at the same time, we have to be tremendously aware and intentional about preserving the character and culture of our existing neighborhoods. And there is room in neighborhoods for new and for existing families to live side by side. Oh my. And what you brought and what I thought was amazing about the Legacy House is not just that they built a house and gave it to a deserving family. It was a unique design that pushed the envelope. So I'm from Cleveland Heights, the first ring suburb of Cleveland, and sometimes you walk around a neighborhood like, who let them build that? But that's diversity of neighborhoods, is that you make room for new things to come in, whether that's design, whether that's people, whether that's investment, and that's the opportunity that we have so that it's not a gentrification conversation. It's about where is there opportunity places. People can't just we can't move everybody to the places of opportunity. We have to create places of opportunity in every neighborhood so that when we're developing, I tell our development team, ask themselves, would I live here? Is this a place I would live? And what do we need to do to create those neighborhoods everywhere and to bring that revitalization on a wider spread basis? That's going to help us address affordable housing. That's going to be able to create naturally occurring affordable housing. Most people who live in affordable housing don't live with any one of us, CMHA or Homeport or any of our partners or Wallach or any of our partners. They live with a private landlord that charges a market-based rent that they can afford. And so how do we create that spectrum within our neighborhoods by protecting the people that live there through different programs? We can talk for ages about owner-occupied repairs and small business loans, and how do we do that with a tactical approach, but it takes that whole spectrum of participation from the community.
Well, I'm going to echo what Leah said. We have to stop believing that gentrification is a bad word. Too many times you go to a community and it's predetermined that, oh, you're going to move us out. The truth of the matter is, if you concentrate on Linden, there's a loss of population that goes way back, and we're talking about filling in where there's been losses. That everybody that lives there can stay there. You can stay in the house or buy a new one in the same neighborhood. It's not talking about moving someone out, or it is absolutely, we're talking about adding to. And it's nice to know that you add to, and that the neighborhood, by people coming in that bring other talents and other gifts, that they're going to add to strengthening that neighborhood. And by the way, they're going to come in and they want the neighborhood safe. So they're going to help do things that needs to be done that isn't being done if there's vacant properties distributed down the street that draw other kinds of activities that are not desired. So one of the plans that we all should be considering is, how do we attract and retain? And I'm in agreement with Leah. We can do both. We can attract and retain, and we just have to have that as a goal, and then we have to work toward it.
Great. All right, well, it's CMC's tradition to take audience questions, so please state your name and ask your question, but please avoid editorial comments. And remember, questions end with a question mark. So let's get started with the first question, please.
I'm Judy Box. I live in Franklinton. I've owned a lot of rental property in Franklinton, and my husband and I are the crazy couple who just built the second privately funded new house in Franklinton. My question has to do with schools. None of you mentioned the word school. When Mr. Moody was talking about where people choose to live, a big part of that conversation is school. I'm not aware of any other country in the world that segregates people based on school district. Everybody else does their school districts by state, and then if you can afford private school, do, but very few do because the schools are better on average, blah, blah. School's also important for development, for jobs, for training, et cetera. I just have a question where you think schools can fit into this grand plan.
Okay, Dr.
Leah,
Box.
this is something you and I talked about last week.
Yeah, okay, Dr. Box, thank you. Well, thank you for that question on the front end. So I will share with you an experience from us on the Near East Side. So we developed and sold 70 homes on the Near East Side starting in 2004. And our experience was this, that people without children were very willing to move into the neighborhood. And when they started to look at their options and their lives changed, then they tended to want to move. But what happened for us is that we had a tremendous partner impact, so OSU, CMHA, and the city, that came in with a strategy to address the feeder pattern for the Near East Side. And so what we saw with our residents who had bought homes from us was that they saw that they had an option, a local option, and did not feel the same pressure that they initially expressed to move. So the conversation changed when that engagement with the school and the feeder pattern changed that school opportunity. So it did get to quality. So Dr. Bosch, your point is very valid in that right now, yes, people may want to move into, particularly we're talking about buying, when people are buying a home, they can move into our urban neighborhoods, but when their life situation changes, whatever that ends up looking like, they then start to look at moving. And so part of this conversation about creating opportunity and creating in the revitalization strategy has to be a strategy to address schools, and what we've seen that be successful on the Near East Side.
Boy, that's a big, it's a big question. Everything Leah said, ditto. I guess it does bring up the point that, this is not just a Central City issue. The city of Columbus includes 19 school districts. I'm looking at my table over there and hoping someone will not. It's 17, 19, something like that. A lot of school districts. And so we do see it, and we think this is addressing affordable housing is something that's not just kind of a downtown and surrounding neighborhoods issue, but it's something that really has to be a regional issue. So part of this is, it's not right to say we should segregate people by income into a certain school district. There are great schools within Columbus City Schools, but Columbus City Schools is not for everyone. And, look, people deserve to have a choice. I have been blessed enough in my life, and I've had enough privilege in my life to have options in terms of where I send my kids. Everybody, there's nothing more fundamental than people having the ability to send their kids to a good school.
Right.
Hello, I'm Sonia Nelson, and I proudly serve as the AVP of Resident Initiatives for Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority. So for those that do not know, CMHA has a home ownership program. So those that receive a subsidy is able to transfer that subsidy into purchasing a home. So, so when we talk about serving those that are income below $30,000, that's a program that is there that supports that group. How do you suggest we strategize to make that more impactful? And is this a program for those that know about it that you think that can be replicated for other organizations?
Yes, Sonia. So we've sold, I know, I'm just talking, doing all the talking. I'm sorry. So we actually recently went through a transaction with CMHA for one of our lease option residents to buy through your program. It's a tremendous program. The self-sufficiency program really does support the family throughout the process. So not only are they learning about home buying and saving and their financial capabilities, but what can they do next? What we find is that we do have barriers with families that are either not just their first-time homeowners, their first-generation homeowners. And so that education piece is so critical to build the internal capacity and the internal will to want to move into home ownership so that we can have more absorption. I would love to talk more about how we can work together more closely on that. We have families buy at our American Addition neighborhood, and one of the things that they did not know. So the taxes went up, so they called us because the taxes went up, and I'm like, who else would they going to call? And so I think I'm looking over here at Hope and Curtis. and John on the land trust. One of the things about the community land trust is that there's an ongoing relationship with you and the land trust. And so as a home buyer, you have a resource to call when things come up that you don't know how to address. And that's that safety net that we're talking about. When you're talking about moving people and building wealth and building assets, and they're going up from low income maybe to a middle income, they have a safety net. They have something behind them that gave them the support to continue that growth in income, whether that was they had enough resources to go get some more training or to school, they had enough resources to be able to purchase a home. They had some level of support, and when you don't have a support network amongst your family or friends or your network, then that's an outside opportunity for that network to be created. So I think there is a lot of work that we could do to continue to encourage participation. And then I'm going to also shout out our private lending partners, because that was one of the challenges with that buyer we just had, was that the loan officer didn't know about the program, and so they didn't understand how to underwrite it when CMHA is paying part of the mortgage and the buyer's paying a part. And so that learning and being with partners like Huntington that knows some of these things helps us be able to do more of that activity, because it's not so much of a wide gap in the learning experience. But it is part of growth. The eroding middle class, part of that is that people don't have the wealth building and the asset building. So if we are able to make that connection, then we are able to grow and be the middle class city that we say that we are, and create that opportunity for more people.
Curt, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, again, as an architect, I really lean on those that understand those programs more than me. All I want to do is design a really nice house and somebody buy it. So that's
Next question. All right, I guess we have 4 more people in line, so we're going to try to get to each question. So let's try to keep it as brief as possible, even though I know how complicated the issue is. Yes.
My name is Becky Westerfelt, and I'm with Huckleberry House. We're obviously interested in people, young adults in particular, who are trying to launch into their first home, usually rental. And one of the questions that we keep coming up to, and I think that it's a developer question, is there's so many cool ideas, and we've had developers come talk to us about kind of alternatives to the traditional apartment, which often doesn't work for a young adult. But it feels like those projects are immediately marketed to the middle class, where they have parents that can sign for them. So I'm just kind of wondering how, because some of these ideas are exactly right. It's a weird combination of private and shared space and, opportunities to do that. But it feels like it goes immediately pretty expensive before it's even done.
So thanks for the question, and it's a challenge, and it takes a lot of creativity. I mean, we just announced late last month, a partnership that we're doing with Star House and with the Finance Fund to take what were 2 very problematic hotels at the base of the hill in the far west side of Franklinton and convert them into transitional housing for youth aging out of foster care. A huge shout out to the Finance Fund and their whole team there, in particular Doug Mormon, for basically seeing this opportunity and seizing on it. And there aren't enough of those opportunities to solve the problem, right? But we have to jump on them when they come. I do think one thing we haven't talked about, and I feel remiss that we haven't said, some of this is frankly just a supply and demand problem. Our market's growing, and that's great. I would much rather be in this situation than the situation they have in some towns up in Northeast Ohio. And this is a good problem to have. But some of the challenges, we just need to create more supply. So when developers come up with these new innovative solutions that may get at first marketed toward your typical early adopter populations that have more disposable income and have additional resources and some ability to adopt these things, that's a good thing to encourage those to come along, because when it proves out at a certain level on the market, it's more likely then to come and filter into other opportunities. So I see promise in some of those options, and really that's kind of a similar model. I keep looking back there because Andy's Swery from the Finance Fund sitting back in the corner. The project in Franklinton is going to kind of follow some of those models, and it's a good example of how what's happening at a certain level in the private sector can then get adopted, and the for-profit sector can then get adopted in the not-for-profit sector.
Okay, and then
real quick. I'll make it real quick.
Okay.
But one thing that Steve didn't point out is that that's what some of the work on the workforce housing funds that the city was putting forward was to, our city hasn't created inclusionary zoning, let's be clear, but they're using their resources and using their incentives. They're increasingly encouraging those for-profit projects that are more creative to include an affordability component to it, whereby you could integrate, because that's what we want, mixed income. We want to integrate our lower moderate income persons into those projects. So I think the opportunity for continued dialogue about when there is public funding and public support, what are the policy initiatives that go with that, could continue to integrate those creative solutions with the needs at the community level.
So let's get to our next question.
My name is Mary Burley, and I'm from Jewish Family Services. I'm a resident of Linden, and I'm really excited about the revitalization. I am concerned about gentrification. And what's going on in my neighborhood right now is that I rent, and there are several other doubles there that are for rent, and they just went up for sale, and they were all bought by the same person, my new landlord, and the rent's gone up already. And so I have to, when my lease is up, I have to move, because I can't afford it. It's really hasn't been affordable for me anyways, because it's not insulated. There's single pane windows. You know, the utility bills are outrageous. So I'm already priced out of that neighborhood. I don't want to move out. I want to stay there. I don't see, one of the things, I know that Homeport has a project that they want to put in there. I'm all for it. But I don't see any real effort, especially by the area commission, to do outreach to a lot of the residents. The only outreach they do is on Facebook. Not everybody's on Facebook. And so not everyone's on their page. And
so you're talking about rent control, or what can be done? Or?
Well, rent control, but I think that the residents who are going to be affected by this the most are the ones that need to be brought in, and they aren't being brought in.
So how do we bring people into the fold when it comes to these new buys and new landlords?
I mean, it's a tough question. I mean, we just went through a really long process in Linden that involved a lot of outreach in developing the One Linden plan that was done by my colleagues in the Department of Neighborhoods. Carla Williams-Scott and Nick Bankston led that, along with our friends from the Neighborhood Design Center. And there was a ton of outreach, and there are a lot of issues. I think there are a couple things that we can do. Number one is we do fund programs through the Urban League and through the free legal help, legal aid. Thank you, to help with tenant rights and those issues. But fundamentally, I mean, there is a fundamental problem in that if a public or not-for-profit entity doesn't own it or doesn't have kind of a spot in the chain of title, we don't have any ability to control the rent. I will tell you, the rent control sometimes comes up. Just being realistic, I would guess that the first move that the city of Columbus made to put in rent control would be preempted by the State House. So, you know, we can talk theoretically about that, but that's not a solution that I think is one that's practical. So it is a problem where you've got properties that there isn't a public or not-for-profit level of kind of ownership, which then allows you to have some control on the rent.
So next question, please. We have two more. We're going to try to get through them real quickly. Sorry, like we said, this is complicated, so.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the panel today. I'm Amy Claben, project facilitator for Move to Prosper. So the comments have been very interesting. People of all income levels, what we have found, do want the opportunity to live where they want throughout the community. And it's very important that we're revitalizing some neighborhoods. We're not revitalizing every neighborhood. I know we can't do that at once. But what are we doing to provide the opportunity for mixed income housing everywhere in our region, not just in some places, so that people who want the choice to be able to live in other neighborhoods, for whatever reason, it's their personal choice, have that opportunity. So thank you.
One of the things that's going on, and again, we're not the only office working with a series of developers for housing of different types, but we work with the Castor organization in the Franklinton area, delivering some market rate housing. What you're hearing about the housing, and this is something that Steve knows very well in the city, is the mayor has determined that when there is housing, that he wants a level of affordability as part of that for mixed income families. And so every new proposed project going forward is supposed to identify how it's going to address affordable market rate housing as part of that development plan. And some of that is slated for the side of the peninsula as the work is being conceptualized there. So there is at least some movement throughout the entire community, not just on one side of town, to try to address that. But it's going to be an ongoing effort.
Real quick, I will just say that, thank you, Amy. We are working on a project in Whitehall right now that would be more of a workforce. Again, to Steve's point about the buckets, it'd be more the people making the $40,000. But the challenge is really about NIMBYism. So we obviously didn't have a conversation about that today, but the challenge is really as we go into any neighborhood, whether it's City of Columbus or one of our surrounding suburban partners, it really is a conversation about how open are people to multifamily developments, period, because it doesn't matter what the income is. I'm getting zoning for residential use. And so multifamily development periods are very challenging in the marketplace because people feel like the burden's on the schools and the burden's on the other infrastructure in the community. And so when we talk about the regulatory, which goes back to Mr. Schottenstein and his talk about density, we're really going to have to continue that conversation at a regional level about being able to get support for multifamily development that can include mixed income elements for groups like us or CMHA. I know they've done some work moving to being able to acquire properties that already exist. And so that's really a different way to address bringing more opportunity to moderate income families and lower moderate income families.
And so there's so much more we could talk about. So let's go to our last question, but I'm gonna volunteer everybody up here that maybe you can catch them afterwards too to talk about it more. But let's go to our last question and let's try to finish this program.
Yeah, the Bob Schottenstein article that was mentioned earlier essentially proposed high density as a solution to affordability, but there are profound implications, as Curt Moody knows as an architect and as I know as an architect. To building high density, you have to plan long range, you have to make infrastructure improvements, you have to have transportation in place, preferably mass transit, and I don't see that happening on any kind of scale. I see smart cities that came up with a fantastic idea to integrate inner city neighborhoods with jobs, education, and healthcare, but then turn around and advocate automated vehicles, which I don't see on the road very often, as the solution to that problem. So I'm wondering who's looking at this with an eye on the near future as opposed to the long term.
Let's let Steve take that last question.
That sounds like a great topic for another CMC. That was, again, the joke first. That is something that we're working very actively. We've been in a partnership with MORPC and 7 other municipalities to look at what would it mean to achieve certain levels of density from what do certain levels of density and certain along certain corridors mean for what we could support in terms of transit? And that's the first step in answering your question.
Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know about you all, but I certainly learned a lot today. Let's thank our sponsors, National Church Residences, Ohio Capital Corporation for Housing, Community Shelter Board, and Columbus Business First. And our wonderful speakers, Curt Moody, Steve Schoeny, Leah Evans, and Andy Chow. And thanks to all of you for being here. We look forward to seeing you next week.